The phone rang at 9:47 in the evening, and I already knew what was coming. Not because I had imagined it, because my mother had called me 23 minutes earlier. Steady voice, measured words, every detail delivered the way Celestine has always delivered difficult things, without drama, without collapse, with the particular composure of a woman's, who decided decades ago that no situation would ever have the satisfaction of seeing her break. She told me where she was. She teach how she got there. She described the letter, printed on paper bearing my name, my title, my Atlanta address, that Darnell had handed her that morning at the house on Cascade. She described the shelter intake form. She described the worker's pen moving across the paper, while my husband stood beside her and spoke my name out loud to a government employee, as though it belonged to him. Then she said, I didn't make a scene in Clifton's house. I wasn't going to do that. I told her I understood. She said, handle it, baby. Handle all of it. She hung up. So when Darnell's voice came through the phone 23 minutes later, calm, deliberate, rehearsed in the way that men rehearse things they have been building toward for a long time, I was not receiving information. I was listening to a performance. I let him finish. Every word, the arrangements he had made, the care he had secured for my parents. His mother and sister now settled comfortably at the house. He said it the way a man says something he believes is already done. I laughed, not loudly, not with any edge he could identify or use. The quiet, private laugh of a woman who has just watched a man walk through a door he cannot walk back through, because the house on Cascade has never belonged to me, was never listed in my name, was never part of my estate, and is titled entirely under Clifton Mercer International Holdings, a private entity my husband has never once thought to investigate in 5 years of marriage. He put his mother in a house that has nothing to do with me. He used my name to do it. He called me in Frankfurt to tell me about it. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are watching this late at night, early in the morning, or somewhere in between, go ahead and tell me in the comments. I want to know who is up with me right now. My name is Cora. I spent 31 years building a life that could not be taken from me. Not because I was lucky, because I was paying attention when it mattered and quiet about it when that mattered more. Darnell had been watching my inheritance for 2 years. He had mapped it, calculated it, and built a strategy around it that he believed was sophisticated. What he had never done, not once, was looked past my name to the people standing behind me, the relationships, the history, the bonds built before I was born that had nothing to do with what I owned and everything to do with what I was worth to people who actually mattered. He thought the house on Cascade was the opening move of his endgame. He had just handed me mine. I told him I heard him. I ended the call. I sat still for exactly 90 seconds, not from shock, not from grief, but because Roosevelt taught me that the most dangerous thing a woman can do in a critical moment is move before she is ready. Then I picked up my phone and dialed a number I have known since childhood. He answered on the second ring. He always answers for Roosevelt's people. The version of my marriage that people saw was composed, stable, and warm in the way that image marriages between two professionals in their 50s are supposed to look. The version I lived was something else entirely. 14 months in, a Sunday dinner at my mother's house on Cascade, Darnell had been everything he was supposed to be that evening. Attentive, respectful, the version of himself he maintained carefully whenever Roosevelt and Celestine were in the room. He knew how to perform for my parents. He had studied them the way he studied everything he wanted something from. Roosevelt mentioned the property casually, not as a topic, just in passing. The way a man references something that has been part of his life so long it requires no introduction. He said. Clifton had the landscaping crew coming before the end of the month, and that Celestine had already told them what she wanted along the south wall. Darnell's attention shifted. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing another person at that table would have caught. It was a sharpening, is a quality of focus that moved across his face for less than 2 seconds before he smoothed it back into the warm attentiveness he had been wearing all evening. He asked, almost idly, whether Clifton Mercer was still involved in the family's affairs. Roosevelt looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Clifton's an old friend, always has been, and he moved the conversation somewhere else with the particular ease of a man who has deflected things he doesn't want to discuss without ever appearing to deflect them. Darnell smiled, let it go, reached for his glass. I watched all of it. I watched him file the information. I watched something behind his eyes go very still and very deliberate. The stillness of a man who has just located something he's been looking for, without knowing exactly what shape it would take when he found it. The moment mattered because it was not the first thing I had noticed. There had been smaller moments before it. Questions about properties that were not ours, an unusual interest in estate matters that did not concern him directly, a habit of remembering details connected to assets while forgetting details connected to people. None of it had been enough on its own. This was the first time the pattern arranged itself clearly enough for me to see. Something in me went still too. But for a different reason. I did not say anything that evening. I did not change my posture, or my expression, or the warmth in my voice when I kissed my parents good night. I drove home with Darnell, and I listened to him talk about the drive and the food and how well my mother was looking, and I responded the way a wife responds when she is present and engaged, and has just made a decision she will not be announcing to anyone. I called Henrietta Moss 11 days later, not with a directive, just a conversation. The kind a woman initiates when she needs someone who carries 11 years of her family's legal history to understand that a pattern she has been quietly observing may require documentation if it continues. Henrietta listened. She asked 2 questions. She said she would update the file. 8 months after that dinner, Roosevelt died. Darnell grieved with precision. The right words at the service, the right silences beside Celestine, the right deference to a room full of people who had loved my father for decades. He was very good at it. I stood beside him and accepted condolences and noted everything. In the weeks that followed, something in him loosened. He became less careful. He began asking questions he would never have asked while Roosevelt was alive. About the trust structure, the estate timeline, what I stood to receive, and when. I answered every question accurately. I answered none of them completely. I told him the trust was substantial. I told him it had been in place for years. I told him nothing about its structure, its protections, or the name of the entity that held it. He heard what he wanted to hear. I let him. Henrietta's file on Darnell was opened 11 days after that dinner on Cascade, 14 months before he made his move. 18 months before he understood what that file was going to cost him. My father never told anyone what he was worth. Not in money, not in influence, not in the particular currency of a man who has spent his life building things that outlast him. He let the things speak. That was Roosevelt. That was always Roosevelt. The neighborhood on Cascade knew him the way communities know people who work without announcement, through what was there when they looked up. The garden at the end of the block that nobody had planted, until one spring it simply appeared, maintained, and generous, and bearing no nameplate. The 2 young men who showed up at his back door every summer, looking for something they couldn't articulate, and left every fall with something they couldn't yet name, but would spend the rest of their lives building on. Clifton Mercer was 17 the first time he appeared at that back door. Right, he was not looking for work or wisdom or any of the things Roosevelt had given the others. He was hungry. He had been hungry for 3 days. Roosevelt's house fired performance it without requiring Clifton to explain himself, without making him feel the weight of receiving something he had not earned yet. That yet was what Roosevelt saw in him. Not ambition. Ambition was everywhere on Cascade, and most of it went nowhere. What Roosevelt saw in Clifton was memory. The specific, active, unsentimentalized memory of a person who registers what is done for them and decides, not emotionally but structurally, that the debt is sacred and will be honored with action rather than words. Roosevelt taught him accounting on a folding table in the kitchen, column by column. Then he made introductions, quietly, strategically, never forced. He placed opportunity in Clifton's path, the way a careful gardener places water, near roots, close enough to reach, never so much it drowns. Clifton built, slowly first, then at a pace that surprised everyone who had been watching except Roosevelt, who had seen the memory in him from the beginning and knew exactly what that kind of memory could construct. Given enough time and the right foundation, it was not a straight climb. His first business failed within 2 years. A partnership he trusted dissolved badly and cost him most of what he had managed to save. There were years when success looked considerably closer from the outside than it felt from where he was standing. Roosevelt knew about those years because Clifton still came by the house, still sat at the folding table, still asked questions, still listened. Most people remember the outcome and forget the distance between the beginning and the result. Roosevelt never did. Clifton Mercer International Holdings was incorporated across a decade of sustained, disciplined work. A private entity with real estate, investment, and consulting operations across 4 countries. By the time it reached the scale that made people in certain rooms take notice, Roosevelt had been retired for 10 years. Clifton came back to the kitchen where it started. He sat across from Roosevelt at the same folding table and said he wanted to build something for him and Celestine. Something permanent. Something that could hold what he did not have language sufficient to say directly. Roosevelt resisted. He said it was too much. He said they had everything they needed. He said Clifton had already given more than enough simply by becoming the man he had become. Clifton let him finish. Then he said, "You fed me when you didn't have to. You can't tell me what's too much. Get in the car." The property was acquired by Clifton Mercer International Holdings and developed over 18 months. The title set the company's name, not for legal strategy. Clifton was clear about that. But because he said the house was a gift from everything the company represented, and it should be held that way permanently, Roosevelt and Celestine Ridge received a formal lifetime occupancy agreement, a legal instrument granting them unconditional right to live on the property for the duration of their lives, transferable to Celestine alone upon Roosevelt's death, requiring no payment, revocable by no one except Clifton's own board. Clifton chaired that board. He always would. Darnell heard the word mansion. He saw the address on Cascade. He saw Zetra's garden and my father's library, and the particular comfort of a house built with intention. He assumed the rest. He assumed all of it wrong. The first evening, Celestine walked to the garden gate and put her hand on it slowly. The way you touch something you cannot believe is real. Roosevelt stood behind her and said nothing. He never needed to. I called him Uncle Clifton until I was 19 years old. That was the year I sat with my mother in the kitchen on Cascade, and asked her something I had been circling for a long time without knowing how to land it. I asked her why we loved him the way we loved blood, not the performance of family, the actual thing. The patience, the specific forgiveness, the, the loyalty that required no maintenance and no explanation and did not diminish with distance or time. Celestine was quiet for a moment, not searching for the answer, considering whether I was ready to carry it. Then she said, "Because he never forgot, and people who never forget are rarer than family." I stopped calling him Uncle Clifton after that, not because the warmth left, because something more accurate replaced it. He had earned something beyond the honorary title we give people we want to hold close. Calling him Clifton was the most honest thing I could offer him. He never commented on the change. That was also who he was. I grew up watching him move through our house with a precision that had nothing to do with performance. He never arrived empty-handed, and he never arrived with something generic. He knew what Roosevelt was reading that month. He knew what Celestine had mentioned 3 Sundays prior on their weekly calls. Not approximately, specifically. He knew what I was studying, what was giving me difficulty, and he had a way of offering what I needed, framed as encouragement. I never felt the weight of being helped. He built Clifton Mercer International Holdings across 20 years and 3 continents without ever becoming the kind of man who needed you to know how far he had come. London was headquarters. Frankfurt housed the European investment arm. Singapore managed the Asia-Pacific consulting practice. He traveled the way people travel, when travel is work rather than identity. Purposefully, without performance, always returning to the same Sunday morning call, regardless of the time zone he was sitting in. He called Celestine every Sunday, not Roosevelt, Celestine. I asked him about that once, when I was old enough to ask it directly. He said Roosevelt was the man who fed him, but Celestine was the one who made it feel like he was supposed to be there. Like he belonged somewhere. He said that distinction between being fed and belonging was not a small thing for a boy who had spent his early years without either. I carried that with me into adulthood in ways I did not fully understand until I was building my own life, and began to recognize the difference between people who provide and people who make you feel that provision is not charity but simply the natural consequence of being valued. When I dialed his number from Frankfurt, I understood precisely what that call was going to mean to him. Not as a business matter, not as a legal one, as a personal one. I was calling to tell him that someone had walked into the house he built as an act of love and installed strangers inside it, using my name as the instrument. I was Roosevelt's daughter calling from Roosevelt City on the lines that Roosevelt's family had always had access to. I knew he would answer. I also knew what delivering his response was going to cost him quietly. The specific cost that men like Clifton absorb without display because they decided long ago that the people they love do not need to manage their emotions on top of their own. He would not let me see it. He never did. That was who he was. That was always who he was. I pressed call. Frankfurt spread out beyond the window. City lights, late traffic, the particular amber stillness of a European evening. 2 rings. My mother called me at 9:24. Darnell called at 9:47, 23 minutes. That was the gap between the 70-year-old sitting in a shelter intake room, writing down an address on a piece of paper she pulled from her coat pocket, and her husband's, calling from wherever he had driven to. After leaving her there, his voice carrying the specific calm of a man who believed the difficult part was finished. He did not know she had already called me. That was the first thing he did not know. It was not the most important one. Celestine had described the morning to me in the measured, sequential way she described everything that required my attention. No trembling. No performance of distress. Just the facts, arranged in order, delivered with the composure of a woman who had decided, before she even dialed, that she was not going to add her panic to my plate. Darnell had arrived at the house on Cascade that morning, carrying a letter. It was printed on paper, bearing my name in the header. My full name, my professional title, my Atlanta address. The letter explained that due to a transition in property management, temporary arrangements had been made for the current occupants. Transportation had been arranged to a fully staffed transitional residence. The matter would be resolved shortly. Everything was in hand. It was signed with my name. My mother read it twice. She recognized my name. She recognized my title. What she did not recognize, and she told me this with a precision that made something tighten behind my sternums, was my voice in a single sentence of it. She said I did not write the way that letter was written. The phrasing was wrong. The structure was wrong. The whole tone of it was a man's idea of how a professional woman communicates, not the actual thing. But she was 71 years old. She was alone in the house. And the man standing in front of her was her daughter's husband. Holding a document bearing her daughter's name, waiting with a patience that was some form of pressure, she went. Not because she believed the letter entirely. She was clear about that. She went because she was Roosevelt's wife, and Roosevelt's wife did not make scenes inside Clifton's house over a man she had already taken the full measure of and found wanting. She would not give him that. She would not give him anything that could not be used against her daughter later. At the shelter, the intake worker reviewed the letter, asked several routines, and requested identification. My mother provided it. Darnell presented himself as the coordinate family representative and explained that temporary housing arrangements had been authorized, whilst a property transition was being completed. He represented the move as a short-term family decision already agreed upon, and accompanied my mother through the intake process while she answered the worker's questions herself. The worker had no immediate reason to believe she was being lied to. What she had in front of her was an elderly woman who had arrived voluntarily, valid identification, a printed letter bearing a family member's name, and a man presenting himself as that family member's authorized representative. The intake worker asked for the name of the authorizing family member. Darnell said, Cora Mercer Langston, her daughter. The worker wrote it on the form. My mother watched him say my name to a government employee. She watched the pen move. She said nothing. She asked for a pen of her own and wrote the shelter's full address on a scrap of paper she folded and placed in her coat pocket. Then she sat down in the chair they showed her, and she waited. 20 minutes after intake, she called me. Her voice was level the entire time. She described the letter, the drive, the intake form, the name he had spoken out loud into an official record. When she finished, she said, I didn't make a scene in Clifton's house. I wasn't going to do that. I asked if she was comfortable. She said the shelter was adequate. Then she said, handle it, baby. Handle all of it. She hung up. I sat still for 90 seconds. Then I opened my laptop and typed 3 words into a subject line. No body text. I sent it to Henrietta Moss and closed the laptop. Henrietta read it at 4:18 in the morning Atlanta time. She was in her office by 6. The room service tray sat on the table untouched. Frankfurt spread beyond the floor-to-ceiling window. Amber streetlight. Decent traffic moving in thin, quiet lines. The particular stillness of a European city settling into its evening. My deal documents were open on the desk. 18 months of structured negotiation closing tomorrow in a conference room 4 blocks away. I dialed. 2 rings. Roosevelt's baby. Not my name. not a greeting. Just that, the identification of whose child I was, spoken in the specific register of a man for whom that identification has always meant something beyond sentiment. Something structural, something that carried obligation in the best sense of that word. I told him everything the way I deliver informations, when the information matters, organized, sequenced, without editorializing. The letter printed on my letterhead. My name signed at the bottom in handwriting that was not mine. The shelter intake form with my name recorded by a government worker while I was sitting in this hotel room for 4,000 miles away. Darnell's call. The timestamps. I finished and waited. The silence that followed lasted almost 10 seconds. I know because I counted. In 41 years of knowing Clifton Mercer, I had never once heard him silent for that long. Not the year his Frankfurt office faced a regulatory challenge that nearly dismantled the European arm. Not the morning I called him from the hospital when Roosevelt's condition changed. Not ever. Clifton was a man who always had the next sentence ready, not from nervousness, but from the kind of a mental clarity that comes from spending decades making decisions in rooms where hesitation is expensive. 10 seconds. I let it be what it was. Then, where is Miss Celestine right now? I gave him the shelter address. The intake time. The name of the worker Celestine had noted on her piece of paper before she folded it into her coat pocket. A shorter silence this time. I'll handle the house. You close your deal. Come home on your own schedule. He was in London. It was past midnight there. He had a board meeting in the morning that I knew had been on his calendar for 6 weeks. He said those 2 sentences anyway, without hesitation, without the performance of sacrifice, the way people speak when a decision has already been made before the words arrive. I understood what he was setting in motion. Clifton's Atlanta property manager had maintained the Cascade property on retainer for 6 years as part of the holdings portfolio. Routine, inspections, seasonal maintenance, contractor coordination. Clifton had full legal authority to direct action on the property through that. Representative without being physically present. He did not need to be in Atlanta to move Atlanta. He never had. What I understood beyond the logistics was something else. Something that does not have a clean name, but that I had felt the outline of my entire life. The specific weight of a person who does not make promises they cannot keep, activating something on your behalf, not from obligation, but from a bond that predates your ability to remember it being formed. He built that house for my parents because my father fed him when he was hungry and my mother made him feel he was supposed to be. Somewhere. This was the same thing, extended across decades. Unchanged. I ordered room service. I reviewed my documents. I marked 3 sections that needed my attention in the morning and set them in order on the desk. I set my alarm. I turned off the lamp. I slept without difficulty for the first time in 2 years. Across Atlanta, a notice was being prepared on Clifton Mercer International Holdings letterhead. Formal, precise, unambiguous. It would arrive at the door on Cascade before sunrise. I was not there for this part. I pieced it together the way you piece together things that happened in rooms you were never meant to be in. From the property manager's documentation. From what Priest eventually said to someone who repeated it to someone else. And from the particular way Vernet described that house to anyone willing to listen in the weeks since that followed. I.A. Absensen. Not once understanding that she was describing something that had never belonged to her son, her daughter, or herself. Darnell had told them enough to make the lie usable and not enough to make it safe. He had said the house was tied to my family, that arrangements were changing, that I was away in Europe, and that the transition had been handled. He had made it temporary when precision was needed and permanent when desire. Vernette heard the part that suited her. Patrice heard the part that should have worried her and chose not to press. Vernette moved through the rooms on Cascade the way a woman moves through something she has decided is finally hers. Slowly, with the specific deliberateness of arrival. She touched the garden gate on her way in. Not to open it, just touched it. The way people make contact with things they are in the process of claiming. She walked the length of the kitchen and commented on the fixtures. She stood in the library doorway and looked at the shelves. 50 years of Roosevelt's reading organized the way a man organizes things he intends to return to, framed photographs placed at intervals between the volumes, and she said it was a beautiful room. She said it the way a woman says, something is beautiful, when she is already imagining it arranged differently. She found the house comfortable in the way that houses built with real intention are always comfortable. There is a quality to them that you feel before you can name it. A steadiness in the rooms, a rightness in the proportions, the sense that whoever designed this space was thinking about the people who would live inside it, rather than the people who would photograph it. Clifton had built it for my parents to finally rest. Vernette rested inside that intention, without knowing whose it was or what it had cost. She settled. That is the word. She settled into that house the way a person settles when they believe the waiting is finished. And the thing they have been patient for has finally been delivered. Patrice moved differently. She was quieter than her mother, touching less, watching more, occupying the spaces she moved through with a kind of provisional quality that her mother did not have. She knew more than Vernette, about how the arrangement had been made. She had asked her brother fewer questions than she should have, and accepted the answers she received with less scrutinies than the situation warranted. That was its own decision. She would carry it. They had been in the house for 11 hours when the envelope arrived. It came at 6:14 in the morning, slid under the front door in a sealed envelope bearing the return address of Clifton Mercer International Holdings, Atlanta Property Division. Vernette found it when she came downstairs. She stood in the hallway in the early morning light and opened it. She read it 3 times at normal pace. Then a 4th time slowly. The way a person reads something they are hoping will change meaning under closer inspection. It did not change. The notice was precise and without warmth. The property was private property held by Clifton Mercer International Holding. The current occupants had no legal authorization to be present. Vacate within 72 hours. Failure to comply would result in formal legal proceedings. A phone number for the holding's Atlanta legal representative was printed at the bottom. It did not mention my name. It did not mention Darnell's name. It did not need to mention either of us. The notice was not addressed to a family dispute. It was addressed to a trespass. Vernette called her son. His phone rang 4 times before he answered. By then, it did not matter what he said. The notice was already in her hand. The 72-hour clock was already running. The thing was done in the only way things that are truly done get done. Quietly, institutionally, without appeal. The 3-word email arrived in Henrietta Moss's inbox at 4:18 in the morning. She read it from her phone in the dark of her bedroom, sitting up before her feet touched the floor. She had been anticipating a message from Cora for 18 months. Not this specific message, not these specific 3 words, but a message that meant the line between preparation and action had been crossed. And there was work to do that could not wait for a reasonable hour. She was in her office by 6. The file was already built. That was the thing about working with Cora. The preparation was always done before the situation required it. Henrietta had opened the file 11 days after a phone call Cora made the month following a family dinner on Cascade, where a man had asked about Clifton Mercer in the specific way that people ask about things to move against. Not curious, calculating. Henrietta had heard Cora's description of that moment and understood immediately what category of husband she was dealing with. The file contained 14 months of careful notation. Property records, the full structure of the inheritance trust, estate documentation going back 2 generations. Every conversation Henrietta had logged, every question Cora had asked, every preparation made in the quiet window before Darnell understood he was being prepared against. She added his move to it now. Before 7 o'clock, she spoke briefly with Celestine, who had already heard from Cora and understood exactly why Henrietta was calling. A signed authorization, allowing release of the intake and documentation, was transmitted to the shelter. Henrietta requested the intake record. It arrived within the hour, a standard intake form, name of authorizing family member, recorded in the designated field. Cora Mercer Langston, written by a worker who had reviewed the information presented to her and recorded the names she had been given during the intake process. Henrietta cross-referenced the timestamp on the intake form against Cora's documented location. Frankfurt Hotel registration, key card records showing room entry and exit times. The flight manifest placing Cora in Germany 11 days before the intake form was signed. The timestamps did not overlap in any way that could be explained by coincidence or miscommunication. Cora was in Frankfurt when her name was written on that form. She had not authorized it. She had not called. She had not sent a representative. Her name had been spoken by another person into an official intake record without her knowledge or consent. That raised issues far beyond a divorce dispute. And because the document was an official intake record rather than a private communication, Henrietta believed there was potential exposures separate from anything the divorce proceedings would produce. 2 tracks running simultaneously. She had enough to begin moving on both. She prepared the filing within 36 hours of arriving at the office. She communicated with Cora in Frankfurt the way the two of them had always communicated. Precisely, without excess. 2 women who understood that clarity in difficult moments was its own form of care. What Henrietta understood about Darnell's move, and what she made sure was reflected in every document she prepared, was that it had not been made in anger. Anger produced impulsive, inconsistent, self-defeating actions that were sometimes difficult to document because they lacked coherent structure. What Darnell had done was structured. The letter on Cora's letterhead, the scripted interactions with the intake worker, the calculated use of a name he had no authority to use. That was not impulse. That was intent. Intent mattered. It was one of the things that separated a simple domestic disagreement from a matter serious enough to attract legal scrutiny. Henrietta had built her filing around that distinction. Her message to Cora reached Frankfurt at 7:52 in the morning. He used your name on an official intake document. That's not just a divorce matter anymore. Cora read it, set her phone face down on the desk, picked up her deal documents. She left for the conference room. Across Atlanta, Darnell had been calling numbers since morning. He did not yet understand that every call going unanswered was a door that had already closed permanently, not accidentally, not temporarily, permanently. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows, and people who had flown in from London, Singapore, Zurich, and New York. 18 months of structured negotiation, completing in a single morning around a table that cost more than some people's first homes, and meant considerably less than the work that had brought everyone to it. I took my seat and I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because the room was impressive. I had stopped being impressed by rooms sometime in my early 40s when I realized that the people who built them were rarely more capable than the people they were designed to intimidate. I was here because I had earned my place at this table through the 18 months of preparation, sustained competence, and the kind of professional consistency that does not require announcement. Roosevelt used to say that a person who has truly arrived never needs to tell the room. The room already knows. I signed where I was meant to sign. I answered what I was asked. When questions came that required more than a signature, the ones that tested whether you actually understood what you had spent 18 months constructing, I answered those too, with the precision of someone who had done the work rather than supervised it. When it was over, the room settled into that particular atmosphere that follows the completion of something genuinely difficult. Not celebration. Exactly. Like the collective exhale of people who have been holding something carefully for a long time and have finally set it down. Hands were shaken. Commitments were acknowledged. The kind of words were exchanged that mean something between professionals who have tested each other across a long negotiation and arrived at mutual respect. The deal added to my financial independence in a way that was meaningful not because I needed it to. The trust had ensured my security long before I married anyone, but because I had built this myself. My access, my relationships, my competence sustained over 15 years of serious work in rooms that did not always want me in them. Roosevelt built found the foundation. I had constructed every floor above it with my own hands and my own judgment and my own willingness to stay at the table when leaving would have been easier. That mattered to me in a way I did not need to explain to anyone in that conference room or anywhere else. There was a dinner. I attended. I ordered something worth ordering, a dish I chose on impulse from a section of the menu I did not usually explore, a wine the sommelier suggested that turned out to be better than I expected. I made conversation, refreshed with people who had spent days measuring me professionally and had arrived at a conclusion I was comfortable with. I was present. I was warm. I was completely undisturbed by anything happening 4,000 miles away in Atlanta. I called my mother from the restaurant. She asked how dinner was. I described the food, the dish, the wine, the particular quality of the room. She listened and then offered a position on European cooking she had been developing since a trip she and my father took in 1987, Reisvertens and Idolin, which she delivered with the confidence of a woman who has had 37 years to refine an opinion and sees no reason to soften it now. We talked for 22 minutes, not about Darnell, not about the notice or the filing or any of it. Just the two of us, talking the way Eloise always talked, about food and travel and the small precise observations that my mother makes about the world that I have been collecting my entire life without ever telling her I was collecting them. After dinner, I booked my return flight, 3 days later than Darnell had expected, on my own schedule, exactly as Clifton had told me to come home. I slept well that night. In Atlanta, I was quite certain no one else was. He called on the second day. I answered, not because I owed him the conversation. I answered because I wanted him to hear what I sounded like when everything he had spent 2 years building had already come apart. I wanted him to have that specific experience. My voice, calm and unhurried, on the other end of a call he had been dreading making. He had spent 72 hours watching his plan disassemble in a sequence he could not interrupt and could not explain away. His mother and sister had been removed from the property by a notice from a company whose name he did not recognize. He had called his attorney immediately after Burnett called him. His attorney investigated the address on Cascade and came back with information Darnell had not built any contingency for. The property had no connection to my estate, no connection to my name, no connection to anything reachable through divorce proceedings or marital asset claims. It was private commercial property held by a private holdings company. His attorney told him plainly there was no viable path to claim an interest in it through the strategy Darnell had built. Then the filing reached him, his name connected to an official intake document. A timestamp, a verified location record, placing me in Frankfurt when my name was written on that form. An attorney named Henrietta Moss, who had apparently been building documentation on him for considerably longer than he had been building his plan against me. He did not accept it immediately. Men like Darnell rarely do. He sought a second opinion, then a third. He spoke to another attorney recommended through a commercial real estate contact and paid for an expedited review of the property records. The answers came back different in wording, but identical in substance. The house on Cascade was not mine. It had never been mine. Whatever strategy he believed he had built around it had nowhere to land. He called expecting the version of me he had decided he married. The one he believed he could pressure back toward a position that suited him. He had prepared a version of this conversation. He had language ready, explanations, a reframing of events that cast his actions as concern rather than calculation. He had rehearsed the tone he would use. Measured, reasonable, the voice of a man trying to find resolution in a situation that had gotten out of hand. I let him deliver all of it. Every prepared sentence. I did not interrupt. I did not shift my breathing or make the small sounds people make when they are reacting to what they are hearing. I simply held the phone and let him finish. When he was done, I said, "Darnell, you put your mother in a house that was never mine to give you. Think about what that means." I ended the call, what it meant, the thing I knew he would spend the rest of that day and most of that night arriving at, was that every calculation he had made across 2 years of careful positioning was constructed on a premise that had never been true. The house on Cascade was not mine. It had never been mine. It was not part of my inheritance, not listed in my estate, not reachable through any instrument connected to our marriage. He had identified it as his primary target and built his entire strategy around accessing something that was never available to him. Not difficult to access, never available. The architecture of his plan was built on a foundation that did not exist. He called his attorney again. His attorney had nothing new. He called 2 men in Atlanta real estate who had connections in property law. Neither produced anything useful. He attempted to construct a narrative around the letter, that Cora had verbally authorized the transition, and the written form was a clerical error, a miscommunication, something that could be explained with her cooperation. His attorney stopped him there. That argument required my cooperation to survive a single hour of scrutiny. His attorney asked directly whether he believed that cooperations was available. Darnell did not answer. The silence on that line was its own answer, and both of them knew it. That evening, a formal notifications arrived from Henrietta's office. Documented, precise. The matter concerning the intake document was proceeding separately from the divorce filing. 2 tracks, independent of each other, both moving. He had one problem when he made his move. He had constructed several more entirely by himself. Henrietta told me about the meeting afterward. Not everything. Henrietta never gave me more than I needed, but enough. She described it the way she described all difficult professional encounters. Precisely. Without editorializing, with the particular economy of a woman who has spent 30 years in rooms where words have consequences. The conference room was on Peachtree. Darnell's attorney arrived with a yellow legal pad and the careful composure of a man who had been told by his client that there was a defensible position somewhere in this situation and had not yet confirmed whether that was true. Henrietta let him settle. Then she opened her file and began. The inheritance, $120 million accumulated through Roosevelt's estate, and several decades of compounding inside a protected structure, was held inside an irrevocable discretionary trust with full spendthrift provisions. She explained each component the way she explained things to opposing counsel when she wanted there to be no ambiguity and no basis for later claim of misunderstanding. Irrevocable. The trust had been structured deliberately by Roosevelt's estate attorney more than 20 years before I married anyone and was designed to resist modification, dissolution, or renegotiation through ordinary legal and financial pressure. Not by a creditor, not by me, not by the kind of claims Darnell was attempting to build. The irrevocability was not a feature, it was the entire point. Roosevelt had watched what happened to wealth that could be renegotiated, and he had made sure his could not be. Discretionary. Distributions from the trust were controlled by an independent trustee, not by me directly. I could not instruct the trustee to release assets simply because someone demanded it, and a divorcing spouse could not compel me to exercise authority I did not possess. The trustee had it. The trustee's single mandate was the long-term preservation and distribution of assets for my benefit, exercised at the trustee's independent judgment. For the purposes of the claims Darnell was pursuing, there was no practicable path to force a distribution that the trustee was not independently inclined to make. Spendthrift provisions. Henrietta explains that under the governing structure of this trust and the facts presented in this case, there was no viable mechanism for Darnell to attach, garnish, or directly reach the assets held inside it. The provisions had been written specifically with divorce protection in mind and had been reinforced by the trust's broader design. This was not unusual estate planning. It was, in fact, one of the primary reasons sophisticated families used structures like this in the first place. Henrietta said Darnell's attorney stopped writing on his legal pad somewhere in the middle of the second element. By the time she finished the third, he had set his pen down entirely. There was no viable mechanism available to accomplish what Darnell wanted, not a complicated one, none that Henrietta could identify under the facts of this case. Darnell had spent 2 years mapping a target, constructing a strategy, and executing a plan against something that at then effectively unreachable for the entire duration of his marriage. He had not been close at any point. He had never been close. The structure he was trying to breach did not have a door he could use. It had not had one for 20 years. It was built specifically to withstand exactly this kind of approach. Henrietta gathered her files from the table with immediate efficiency, with the unhurried efficiency a woman whose work in this room was finished. She looked at opposing counsel and said, "The fraud matter is separate. That one he'll need to answer for on his own." She left him with that. In the parking garage of the building, Darnell's attorney sat in his car and called his client. The call lasted 4 minutes. Henrietta learned this afterward from a detail she did not share with me until much later. But she said Darnell did not speak for most of those 4 minutes. He listened. The way a man listens when the last door he believed was available has just been described to him as a wall that was never a door at all. Henrietta mentioned it the way she mentioned things she considered already resolved. Briefly, without build-up, dropped into the middle of a longer update, like a detail she almost forgot to include because it had already been handled before I landed. Clifton had come through her office 2 days before my flight touched down in Atlanta. He had not told me he was coming. He had not called ahead to Henrietta either. He simply appeared at her office, sat across from her for 40 minutes, reviewed what she had filed and what was moving, asked 2 questions, and left. Henrietta said he was the calmest person she had spoken to in the entire duration of this situation. She said it with the particular respect that one composed professional extends to another. He did not go to the house first. He went to the shelter. He sat with my mother for 2 hours in a visiting room with fluorescent lighting that flattened everything. And chairs for function rather than comfort. He did not mention that house. He did not mention Darnell or the notice or the fraud filing or any of what had been set in motion. He asked about her garden, what she had put in along the south wall that spring, what she was planning for the fall border. He asked what she was reading. She told him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a book, a specific edition of something she had mentioned, wanting 3 months prior on one of their Sunday calls, and set it on the table between them without explanation, the way he always delivered things he had been quietly carrying for some time. Without ceremony, without the performance of generosity, as though paying attention to what people needed and then providing it was simply what a person did. My mother thanked him the way she thanked people she loved, without making it large, without the elaborate gratitude that would have embarrassed them both, just thanked him and put the book in her lap, and that was enough for both of them. Then he went to see about his house. The property manager met him at Cascade with the full documentation. The notice had been complied with inside the 72-hour window. Vernette and Patrice had vacated. The house was exactly as it had always been. The library undisturbed. Roosevelt's volumes in their order, the photographs on the shelves, Celestine's garden along the south wall exactly as she had left it. Nothing taken, nothing rearranged into something it was not supposed to be. Clifton walked through the rooms without commentary. The property manager told me later that he moved through the house the way a person moves, through something they built, not checking it, just confirming it. Confirming it was still itself. He arranged for my mother's return before he left the property. Not dramatically. He told the property manager to coordinate it, and the property manager did. The following mornings, Celestine returned to Cascade with everything she had taken to the shelter. She came through the front gate, the way she always came through it. Without announcement, without ceremony, with the particular ease of a woman returning to a place that has always been hers to return to. She touched the gate on her way in, just her hand on the latch for a moment. Then she went inside. Clifton was back in London by the time I landed. He had been in Atlanta for 3 days and had not spoken to a single person outside of Henrietta and my mother and his property manager. No statement, no visibility, nothing that could be called performance. He called Celestine from Heathrow before his flight boarded. They talked for 40 minutes. When Henrietta told me all of this, I sat with it for a long time. I turned it over. I looked for the words that fit what it meant, and I could not find them. Eventually, I decided that words were not the right instrument for it, and I stopped looking. Atlanta does not announce its judgments. That is not how the city operates. There are no public declarations, no formal removals, no moments where someone stands in a room and names what has been decided. The city is far too polished for anything that direct. What happens instead is quieter and considerably more permanent. Doors close, rooms fill, and the person who expected extiputeslu finds themselves on the outside, without explaining the transistence. Ever explaining the transition. Darnell had spent 5 years inside our marriage building toward a specific position in this city. Not the position he had. He was moderately successful in commercial real estate at a level that had always felt insufficient next to the world he had married into. He wanted the North Side networks, the financial and real estate circles that intersected at a level above where he was operating. The social infrastructure that in Atlanta connects professional standing to community access in ways that are real and consequential and entirely dependent on who vouches for you and what your name means when it is spoken in the right rooms. He had been moving toward that position steadily. He believed our marriage, and what he believed my inheritance would eventually unlock, was the instrument that would close the remaining distance. He had been patient about it the way he was patient about most things he wanted. Quietly, deliberately, with the long-game discipline of a man who believed he understood the board. What moved through Atlanta instead was this. A man had used his wife's name on a government intake document while she was in Frankfurt closing an international deal. That wife was Roosevelt's daughter. And Roosevelt was a name that carried specific permanent weight in certain circles of this city, the kind of weight that accumulates not through announcement but through decades of quiet integrity that people remember without being reminded to. The property the man had claimed as leverage turned out to be titled under Clifton Mercer International Holdings. And Clifton's name meant something different but equally unmovable in those same circles. The fraud filing was public record. The unauthorized occupancy notice was public record. People who knew Clifton's understood what it meant that someone had walked into his property uninvited and installed strangers inside it, not as a legal abstraction, as a statement of character. A declaration of who a person was when they believed no one withstanding was watching. People who knew my family understood what it meant that my name had been placed on a government document by a man who had no authority to use it. Neither of these things required explanation. They explained themselves. Darnell was not confronted. He was not called out at an event, or removed from a professional group, or spoken to directly by anyone who owed him the discomfort of honesty. That was not Atlanta's way. What happened was quieter than that, and landed harder because of it. The call he had been expecting from a broker on the north side did not come. The introduction that had been informally promised at a gathering 2 months prior did not materialize. The invitation to a Buckhead event that had seemed to be moving toward him reversed direction without explanation. The man who had been returning his messages within the hour began taking 2 days and then stopped altogether. A mixed-use commercial project he had been pursuing for nearly 8 months was awarded to another firm. This one mattered. He had already invested months of meetings, proposal revisions, consultant fees, and relationship building into it. He had spoken about the project confidently enough that people around him assumed it was close to done. Officially, no reason was given. Officially, it was simply a business decision. Unofficially, Darnell understood the timing well enough to stop pretending coincidence was involved. The rooms he had been positioning himself toward for 5 years quietly rearranged themselves. No confrontation, no explanation, no moment he could point to as the thing that changed everything. Just the gradual, irreversible realization that the doors he had been approaching were no longer doors at all. He called me one more time. I saw his name on my screen. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving. I was already home. I did not go to the house first. I went to my mother, That was never a decision I needed to make consciously. It was simply the direction I moved in when I landed. The way water moves toward the place it has always gone, not from obligation. Because Celestine was where I oriented myself when the world had been tilted and needed setting back to level. She had always been that. She would always be that. The house on Cascade was exactly as it had always been. The garden along the south wall was in its full summer reach. She had planted early that year, before any of this began, and the beds were dense and generous the way they always were by late June. We sat outside in the afternoon with something cold and the specific quiet that exists between two people who have never needed to rehearse what they want to say to each other because they have always said it without preparation. She did not ask about Henrietta's filings. She did not ask about Darnell's attorney or the fraud case timeline or any of the machinery that had been running while I was away. She asked about Frankfurt. She asked about the deal, who had been across the table, what the negotiation had looked like in its final hours, what the city felt like in the evening when the work was done. She listened to my professional life the way she had always listened to it, with genuine attention, without performance, with the particular quality of pride that my mother has never once stated directly and has never needed to. We sat in that garden until the light shifted from afternoon into early evening and the temperature dropped just enough to feel it. Then I drove to the house I had shared with Darnell. I had timed it carefully. So I knew his schedule well enough to know when the house would be empty, and I did not want a confrontation. Not because I was afraid of one, because I had nothing left to say that required his presence to be said. Everything that needed to be communicated between us was already in motion through channels that did not need my voice to keep moving. I walked through the rooms with the efficiency of a woman who had done the emotional stir work of this departure across 2 years of quiet preparation, and was now completing the logistical portion. I took my documents from the study, my grandmother's china from the dining room cabinet. It had come into the marriage in my name, and he had always known better than to claim it. The photographs my father had given me, that I had hung in the hallway because I had wanted them near me and would now take them somewhere else. Several other things that were simply mine in the way. Certain things belonged to a person regardless of what a shared address might imply. I did not search the house for evidence of who he had become while I was making my preparations. That chapter was closed. What he had done with himself inside it was no longer information I needed. I moved through each room once. I did not go back. I left my key on the kitchen counter. Not as a statement, not with any weight placed on the gesture beyond its practical meaning. I set it down on the laminate and walked out through the door I had walked through hundreds of times across 5 years of a marriage that had been over in every way that mattered. Since the evening I watched him recalibrate behind his eyes at a dinner table on Cascade, and it made a decision never announced to anyone. I called Henrietta from the car before I pulled out of the driveway. "I'm done at the house," she said. "Then we're moving." I pulled out of the driveway, and I did not look back at it. There was nothing back there worth the turn of my head. Everything was accounted for. The trust was intact. It had never been in danger, not for a single day of my marriage. But there is a particular quality in transferring the security effectively of something after someone has spent 2 years trying to breach it. It feels different. Not relief exactly. More like the satisfaction of watching a structure was built, hold exactly the weight it was designed to hold without shifting a single degree. The house on Cascade was restored. My mother was in her garden. The fraud case was moving through the system with Henrietta's hands on it. which meant it was moving with the kind of precision that serious legal pretire ever require and rarely receive. The divorce was filed. The marriage was concluded in every dimension that required conclusion. I sat with all of it, in the stillness that follows the completion of something you have been carrying quietly for a long time. Not celebration, not the loud exhale of a dramatic ending, just stillness. The particular stillness of a woman who prepared carefully, waited patiently, and watched everything land exactly where she had understood it would land. I thought about Roosevelt, not the version I constructed for eulogies or offered to people who asked about my father in social settings. The private version, the man at the folding table with a 17-year-old boy and a ledger, and the specific patience of someone who understood that what he was teaching was not accounting. He was teaching a boy how to see, how to look at a situation, and identify what was actually there rather than what he wished were there. That skill, applied with integrity over 50 years, had built everything that mattered in this story. Not my inheritance, not the house, the relationships. The dozen bonds that existed in rooms Darnell never thought to look inside. I thought about Clifton sitting in that visiting room with the fluorescent light and the inadequate chairs, asking my mother what she had planted along the south wall. A man who runs a private holdings company across 4 countries, who had a board meeting the morning after I called him, who flew to Atlanta without an announcement and went to a shelter before he went to his own property, because that was the order Roosevelt would have chosen, and Clifton had spent 50 years orienting himself by that compass. That was what 2 years of Darnell's research had missed entirely. He had been diligent. I want to be accurate about that, because accuracy matters more to me than the comfort of diminishing him. He had mapped the estate. He had identified the trust. He had located the house on Cascade and constructed a strategy around it that was, on its surface, organized and patient and not without sophistication. He had done the work that a man does when he is serious about taking something. He had never once looked past the surface of what I owned to ask what I meant to the people standing behind me. He had never researched Clifton Mercer beyond the name. Never asked what that bond was built on, how old it was, what it would do when someone pressed against it. He had never considered that the house he identified as his primary target had a history that predated my birth and a legal structure that had nothing to do with my estate or my name or anything reachable through our marriage. He studied the inventory of my life with considerable care. He never once attempted to understand its architecture. He came for what I owned. He never thought to ask what I was worth to the people who actually mattered. He never understood that those were 2 entire different questions, and that only one of them would have told him anything useful about what he was walking into. That was the miscalculation, not the forged letter, not the shelter intake form, not the unauthorized occupancy, or the fraud filing, or the trust provisions. Those were consequences. The miscalculation was older and simpler and entirely his own. He studied everything I had. He never once thought to study everything I was. That was always going to be his ending.